takeoff, 27 left, approach 135, 2 left.
Unit 297, contact on control 134, decimal 125, goodbye.
134, 125,
Moments after takeoff from London Heathrow, a British Airways flight is plunged into darkness. With nothing to guide him but the faint horizon out the window, the captain struggles to keep his plane flying level. 82 lives hang in the balance as the pilots try to figure out what to do next. What you're about to see is a story about how people make decisions under pressure, and it's a story about the forces that influence their decisions. This is the story of British Airways Flight 870. It was a cold October's evening in 2005 when 76 passengers and 6 crew boarded a British Airways Airbus A319 at London's Heathrow Airport. The flight, designated as Flight 870, was bound for Budapest, the capital city of Hungary. On board were a mixture of tourists travelling to see the historical European city and Hungarians returning home from the UK. The journey was expected to take about 2.5 hours. In command of the flight was an experienced captain. At 53 years old, he had racked up almost 12,000 flying hours in his time as a pilot, 4,000 of which were on the Airbus A320 series aircraft. Before this, he had flown the medium-hull Boeing 757 and 767. Sitting to his right was a 29-year-old first officer. By comparison, she was relatively new to flying, with just 2,000 total hours, almost all of which were on the A320 family. Pilots receive extensive training on a whole range of emergencies, from engine failures during takeoff to rapid decompressions and smoke and fire on board the aircraft, among many others. They are also rigorously tested on their knowledge and skills every 6 months in highly realistic full-motion flight simulators. But what happens when a crew is presented with an emergency which they have never faced before? An emergency in which the aircraft behaves in ways which the manufacturer had not envisaged. As the two pilots completed their pre-departure preparations, they had no idea that just minutes after takeoff, they would experience exactly this type of emergency. How they responded in the heat of the moment could make the difference between life and death for everyone on board. Just after 8 o'clock, Flight 870 pushed back from its gate at Heathrow. On board were 82 passengers and crew and just over 13 metric tons of fuel. The pilots started the engines and began navigating Heathrow's maze of taxiways out to the active runway. The captain would be flying the aircraft to Budapest on this evening, and he had something of a challenge in store when he got there. He had reviewed the weather forecast back at the gate, and the conditions at Budapest were less than ideal. It was foggy, with clouds hanging just 200 feet above the airport, visibility as low as 500 metres, and the possibility of rain later in the evening. But still, that was something the pilots could concern themselves with further down route. For now, they just had to get the plane airborne and climbing through London's famously busy airspace up to cruising altitude. Before we continue, I want to give a quick mention to this video's sponsor, War Thunder. War Thunder is the most comprehensive vehicle combat game ever made. When I say comprehensive, I mean that there are over 2,500 tanks, planes, helicopters, and ships you can play as. Everything from the biplanes and armoured cars of the 1920s to the fighter jets and battle tanks of today. What I like about War Thunder is how immersive it is. Every vehicle is modelled down to its individual components, like engines, fuel tanks, weapons, and crew. All of these can be damaged or disabled by enemy fire, so when your vehicle sustains damage, you actually get to see which parts were impacted. When you play War Thunder, you're joining a community of over 70 million players, which makes for a really active and dynamic environment. And it's an environment which is constantly changing, because you can customize your vehicles with a huge range of camouflages, historical markings, and decorations, including some made by the War Thunder community itself. War Thunder is available for free on PC, PlayStation, or Xbox. Sign up now using my link in the pinned comment below or in the video description. By using this link, for a limited time only, you'll get access to a massive bonus pack available across all platforms for an exclusive vehicle decorator, Eagle of Valor, 100,000 Silver Lions, and 7 days of premium account. You don't need any complicated gaming setup to play either. All you need is a mouse and keyboard. At 20 minutes past 8, the captain lined his aircraft up on the runway and set takeoff thrust. Despite all of the automation in the modern cockpit, the takeoff has remained more or less a manual affair. As the aircraft accelerated, the captain kept it on the runway centerline using the rudder pedals, And then, once he had reached what's known as rotation speed, he pulled the side stick gently backwards until the plane's nose rose into the air. Less than a minute after beginning its takeoff roll, Flight 870 was airborne. The first officer raised the landing gear and then retracted the flaps as the aircraft climbed and accelerated. Not long after takeoff, the captain engaged the autopilot. In London's busy airspace, there's not much room for imprecision, and autopilots have been doing a better job than humans in that regard for decades. But with the reliance on automation that such technological advancements encourage, there is still something to be said for going back to basics from time to time. The reasons for this are about to become abundantly clear. Flight 870's routing would bring it out over the town of Clacton, on the UK's east coast, and then over the North Sea, before making landfall over the Netherlands, and then proceeding deeper into the European continent, reaching Budapest at around 10:30. For the first few minutes, everything on board was normal. Destination weather notwithstanding, the skies above London were perfectly clear. Passengers sitting by the windows were treated to excellent views of the distinctive London city skyline as the plane travelled east. Air traffic control had cleared the flight to climb up to 23,000 feet, and the pilots were expecting to be cleared to their final cruising altitude soon. But just 8 minutes after takeoff, as the plane neared the coast, something completely unexpected happened. In the cockpit, there was a loud clunk and the lights went out. Flight 870 had gone dark. The pilots were shocked. The first officer's immediate thought was that the engines had failed, but with the plane still climbing, this appeared not to be the case. The captain grabbed his side stick and the thrust levers and began flying the aircraft manually. All of the plane's automation had been disabled by the catastrophic loss of electrical power. The captain had trained for electrical problems in the simulator, but those scenarios had simply not prepared him for the problems that he now faced. Without his primary flight display, he had lost vital information about the plane's speed, altitude, and attitude. Without his navigation display, he had lost any clear sense of where he was and what other aircraft were around him. The captain should have been able to use the small standby instruments to see the plane's attitude, speed, and altitude, basic information which is absolutely essential for pilots. But contrary to what Airbus had promised, the lights which illuminated these instruments were not working. Without a single instrument to rely on, the captain now had to fly his state-of-the-art aircraft with nothing to guide him but the view out his window. In the dead of night, this wasn't an easy task. The only instrument still working in the cockpit was the lower display unit, and it told a story that did not bode well for the aircraft. The captain tried to declare an emergency to air traffic control, but in the stress of the moment, he pressed the red autopilot disconnect button on his side stick, rather than the push to talk button on the front of the side stick. When he realised his mistake, and tried again using the correct button, he got no response. The aircraft's radios had been another casualty of the power loss. High over the UK, the pilots were on their own. Back on the ground, controllers knew that something odd was happening somewhere in the skies above Clacton. British Airways Flight 870 had disappeared from radar. The air traffic controller responsible for the flight radioed the pilots, but he was met with silence. If the flight had just lost its transponder, it would disappear from radar, but it would still be contactable over the radio. The fact that it was no longer on radar and was not responding to radio calls raised serious red flags at air traffic control. In the cockpit, the pilots were having communication problems of their own. The flight deck is a noisy place, with wind hitting the airframe at hundreds of kilometers per hour and computer fans whizzing constantly. To make communication easier, pilots talked to each other through noise-cancelling headsets. But without power, these headsets had now become useless. The pilots had to raise their voices to hear each other speak, and somehow develop a plan to restore power to the aircraft and get it back on the ground. The pressure they were under was immense, and at this point, they still had no idea what was wrong with their aircraft. In the back, the passengers also found themselves in the dark, so to speak. The main cabin lights had lost their power supply, and now only the emergency lights lit up the cabin. The passengers' only source of information about what might be going on was the cabin crew. But with the interphone system unpowered, the cabin crew couldn't get through to the pilots. Even facing the immediate threats coming from within the aircraft, the captain also had to consider the threats from the outside. His last clearance from air traffic control had been to climb to flight level 230, about 23,000 feet. This was the only altitude which could guarantee that he wouldn't collide with another aircraft. As he recalled, he had been climbing through about 19,000 feet when the power was lost, which meant that he had another 4,000 feet to go before he could level off. Squinting through the darkness, the captain could just about make out the standby instruments. Even though they weren't lit, the instruments at least appeared to be working. They would give him some idea of his altitude, speed, and attitude. While the captain flew the aircraft, the first officer began making her way through the checklist, which had now appeared on the lower display unit. Following procedure, the first officer read each checklist item aloud, including the action she was supposed to take. This was then confirmed by the captain before she carried out the action. The pilots were overwhelmed, but they had to go about solving the aircraft's problems systematically. One false step, and they could make this bad situation much worse. Even though the display unit showing the checklist was working, the darkness in the rest of the cockpit meant that the buttons and switches mentioned in the checklist were extremely difficult to find. With almost 2,000 hours on the aircraft, the first officer was intimately familiar with the layout of the overhead panel, but in nearly pitch darkness, it became almost impossible for her to make sure that she was making the right selections. She cautiously progressed through the checklist, double and triple checking everything she did. As part of the checklist, she had to switch the engines to a more manual setting, where the speed of the engines was directly controlled by the position of the thrust levers. Unlike Boeing pilots, Airbus pilots don't get much hands-on time with the thrust levers. These are controlled by the autothrust system for almost the entirety of the flight. While this may help reduce pilots' workload in normal operations, when it comes to emergencies like this, it can leave pilots lacking at this basic aspect of flying, simply operating the engines. As the captain continued to climb to flight level 230, his right hand adjusting the thrust levers, a nearby aircraft was trying to contact him over the radio at the request of air traffic control. But just like the controller, it couldn't get through. Over a minute had now passed since the loss of power, and concerns were beginning to grow about what was happening on board Flight 870. As useful as the electronic checklist was, this particular one had a serious flaw. Each of the items that the first officer had completed thus far was related to restoring or reconfiguring particular subsystems which had been lost. Buried all the way at the bottom of the checklist, which the first officer would have to scroll down to, was the item which would restore power to the aircraft. This involved switching it over to an alternate electrical supply. What this meant was that the checklist that Airbus designed had left the pilots quite literally in the dark, flying manually at night with nothing to go on but the horizon out the window. If this item had been put at the top of the checklist, the pilots would have been able to restore power to the aircraft immediately. This design had unnecessarily put everybody on board in danger. But there was no time for discussions of checklist philosophy in the cockpit of Flight 870. The first officer pushed the alternate button, and power was restored to the aircraft. A warm, familiar glow returned to the flight deck as the lighting kicked in and the screens rebooted. The pilots were massively relieved. They were now back in a situation which was at least faintly recognizable. But relieved as the pilots were, their minds were still racing with questions. What had caused the loss in power? Could it happen again? And if it did, what else might go wrong? They needed to assess the situation quickly and develop a plan to ensure the safety of the aircraft. The captain saw that he was now approaching flight level 230, the last level he'd been cleared to by air traffic control. He leveled off and then reconnected the autopilot. The auto thrust still wasn't working, so he needed to handle the thrust levers manually. But still, the return of the autopilot had brought him some precious time to think. He handed over control to the first officer while he began reviewing the situation. First, he contacted air traffic control, issuing a PAN call, which is one step down from a mayday. Controllers were relieved to hear from the flight and to see it back on their screens. They instructed the captain to continue flying straight ahead at his current altitude. But the captain was concerned about the state of his aircraft. Power may have been restored, but he was still unsure why it had gone off in the first place. And what's more, there was still plenty of systems which weren't working, the least of which was the autothrust. It didn't seem safe to let the aircraft continue flying out over the sea, away from suitable airports. The captain told the controller that he needed to turn back over land, and he was then instructed to turn onto a heading of 290 degrees back west towards London. In order to give himself more time to evaluate the situation, the captain then asked to enter a holding pattern. The controller cleared him to enter the hold at a waypoint called Brazo, a few miles to the southwest of Clacton. The pilots set this hold up on their flight management computer and began tracking towards it. So far, the crew had done an excellent job of managing the emergency situation, staying calm under pressure and restoring some semblance of normality to the flight. But they would come under fire from some quarters for what they did next. And this is where the story of Flight 870 really begins. Once established in the holding pattern at flight level 230, the captain began trying to figure out which systems were still working and which were not. Despite having restored power to the aircraft, one of the units which converts the AC current from the electrical generators to DC required by the aircraft systems, known as a transformer rectifier, was not working. The last thing the captain wanted was for the power to go again. As a precaution, he started the auxiliary power unit, a small jet engine in the tail of the plane. He didn't need the electricity from it now, but if the aircraft suffered another power loss, he wanted to be able to tap into this supply quickly. An assortment of other systems had been lost, including the heating on the captain's windscreen and his side window. The cabin temperature control was also no longer working, and neither was the ventilation for the avionics in the cockpit or the ventilation for the bathroom and the galley. This was not the healthy plane that the captain had departed Heathrow with just a few minutes ago. Trying to locate the source of these problems, the captain brought up the electrical systems page on his central display. On it, everything appeared to be working normally, except for the number 1 transformer rectifier, which was highlighted in amber. The captain assumed, understandably but incorrectly as it would turn out, that the failure of the transformer rectifier was the cause of the power loss. The reality was that rather than being the cause of the power loss, it was yet another victim of the true reason for the power loss. That was the failure of one of the 2 main electrical generators, Gen 1, which was upstream of the transformer rectifier. But pilots don't need to be experts on their aircraft's electrical systems. The real experts are those who work in maintenance. If the captain could get through to an engineer at British Airways, he might be able to get some clarity on what was going on with the plane. He radioed British Airways Maintenance Control Centre and described what had happened to the aircraft. In the back of the plane, the passengers were still oblivious about what had happened. All they knew was that the lights had gone out for a few moments and that the plane now appeared to be turning over the suburbs to the east of London. They had no idea that just a few moments ago the lights in the cockpit had gone out too, not to mention the cockpit displays and instrumentation. In between calls to maintenance, the captain made a PA, telling the passengers and cabin crew that there had been a technical issue with the aircraft. He said that they were now in a holding pattern while they considered what to do next. Naturally, the passengers were keen to continue to Budapest. There weren't any more flights there from Heathrow that evening, and if they were to return to London, they would have to wait until the next day at the earliest to get another flight. But they didn't know quite how badly things had gone wrong up front. And up in the cockpit, a new problem was brewing. Neither the pilots nor the maintenance engineer they were talking to knew how serious the problem was either. During the captain's conversation with maintenance control, a misunderstanding had developed. Reception over the radio was bad, and the frequency was being used by several other aircraft as well, so it was difficult for both the captain and the engineer to have a proper conversation. What this meant was that the engineer missed several important parts of the captain's transmissions. This included the sheer amount of screens, lighting and instruments the cockpit had lost during the power failure. It also included the fact that the pilots had needed to press the AC/ESS feed push button to restore power to the aircraft. This was an important fact because it would have told the engineer that the problem was more than just an issue with the transformer rectifier. As a result of this, the engineer was under the impression that the aircraft's problems had started with the failure of the transformer rectifier. The reality was that the issue lay much deeper, with the component that provided the plane's electricity to begin with, Generator 1, or Gen 1. This was a much bigger problem, and it still posed a threat to the aircraft. If it could fail once, it could easily fail again. But without knowing that this was the problem, maintenance control simply couldn't provide sound advice. So, operating under the false impression that the problem lay with a transformer rectifier, the engineer checked his maintenance documentation to see whether the aircraft could safely fly with this inoperative. As it turned out, it could. The engineer then advised the captain that it would be possible to continue the flight all the way to Budapest, carrying this fault. When the plane landed in Budapest, local maintenance personnel there could reset the system, and the aircraft would be back in top condition. Problem solved, it seemed. The flight had the A-OK from maintenance control to continue to Budapest. This was an easy piece of advice for the engineer to give, sitting safely on the ground. But ultimately, it was the captain's decision about whether to return to Heathrow or to continue the flight to Budapest. And it wasn't a simple decision to make. The two pilots now began discussing their options as the plane flew around the holding pattern to the northeast of London. On one hand, even with the power now restored, the plane still had problems. Was it responsible to take this aircraft out over the North Sea and then hundreds of miles across Europe, knowing that it had issues? The pilots began flicking through their onboard documentation, trying to figure out what it would mean for them to continue the flight with each of these systems inoperative. One important issue they had was the lack of windscreen and window heating on the captain's side. Buried in the A320's documentation was a restriction stating that in order to take off with an unusable windshield and window heating, the plane would have to avoid icing conditions for the entirety of the flight. Could the captain really ensure that on a 2.5-hour flight he could remain clear of icing conditions? All it would take to fall foul of this restriction would be for the pilots to inadvertently fly into a cold cloud, something there isn't much of a shortage of in the sky. And speaking of clouds, there was still the increasingly concerning issue of the weather at Budapest. When the pilots had checked earlier, conditions had been bad enough to be challenging even in a fully functioning plane. In fact, the visibility was forecast to be so low that the pilots might have needed to get the plane to perform an auto-land, something that is rarely done. But without a functioning autothrust, the plane wouldn't even be able to land itself. If that happened, the pilots would have to divert to another airport. Did it really make sense for the captain to take his faulty plane on a 2-hour night flight to an airport where the weather was marginal and from where he may have to divert in any case? And this was all assuming that the plane would continue functioning more or less how it had been since the pilots had restored power. Weighing heavily on their minds was the possibility that it would not do that, and that they would lose power again somewhere over Europe or out over the North Sea, or, worst of all, on final approach to Budapest when they were low to the ground and couldn't yet see the runway through the fog. If more faults emerged en route, or if the power failure happened again, would they have the same luck they had had the first time? Surely the sensible thing to do was to call it a night and bring the plane back to Heathrow where they knew they would be safe. But all of this was only one side of the arguments the pilots had to have with themselves. On the other hand, if they chose to return to Heathrow, the airline's management would not be pleased. After all, the airline's own engineers had advised the captain that the flight was okay to continue to Budapest. Why would the captain ignore advice from somebody who knew more than him about the aircraft systems? If he returned to Heathrow, the cost to the airline in wasted fuel and passenger rebookings would run into the tens of thousands of pounds. This was made all the worse by the fact that just a few months previously, a brand new piece of legislation was passed in the European Union called the Air Passengers' Rights Regulation. This entitled any passengers on a flight delayed by more than 3 hours to significant financial compensation. In other words, returning to Heathrow would be a costly choice. But then, at least on paper, pilots aren't supposed to make safety-related decisions based on commercial considerations like this. What the captain had to consider, which the airline's management didn't, was a different cost altogether. The cost of things going wrong in the air for a second time, and maybe this time without such a positive result. Deliberations continued for 40 minutes as Flight 870 flew in a holding pattern at 23,000 feet out to the northeast of London. Finally, at 10 minutes past 9, the captain made the decision. He figured that with the faulty transformer rectifier already offline, it was unlikely to cause any more problems. Maintenance control had given him the all clear, and he trusted their judgment. Flight 870 would continue to Budapest. Again, what neither the pilots nor maintenance knew was that the problem was never with the transformer rectifier to begin with. The real problem, Gen 1, was humming away quietly in the background, and it was fully liable to fail again. Blind to this fact, the captain informed air traffic control that he would be continuing the flight. He then made an announcement to the passengers and cabin crew to this effect. The first officer pointed the plane out east and began climbing to flight level 330. By this point, confident that they didn't need the electricity and not wanting to waste fuel, the pilots turned off the APU. Before long, Flight 870 had reached its cruising altitude, and was well on its way to Budapest. The pilots were closely monitoring both their instruments and the weather at their destination. Given how badly things had started out for the flight, it was relief for the pilots that the only lasting consequence appeared to be that they were 40 minutes late, having spent about that time in the holding pattern over the UK. The captain had taken back control of the aircraft from the first officer, and he had found a thrust setting which kept the aircraft at a reasonable cruising speed. It was unusual to be flying such a modern jet at cruising altitude on manual thrust, but it was hardly unsafe. As long as the weather held up at Budapest, what started out as a near disaster would have become nothing more than an inconvenience in the story of Flight 870. The passengers had all but forgotten about the issue earlier in the flight, as they tried to get some rest before their arrival into Budapest. But at about 10:30 UK time, as the pilots began their descent, their plane had a final nasty surprise in store for them. The temperature at normal cruising altitudes is about -50 degrees Celsius. As a result, the aircraft's skin is chilled to well below freezing during the cruise, and it stays this way for much of the descent. As Flight 870 descended, the warm moisture in the atmosphere hit the cold glass of the windscreen, and the captain's side window frosted over. At 10 minutes to 11 that night, Flight 870 lined up at the runway for its final approach. The pilots lowered the landing gear and slowed the aircraft down. When they finally broke out of the clouds, the full effects of the captain's frosted over windscreen became all too clear. While the first officer could see the runway out her windscreen, the captain was effectively blind. There was no way he could land the aircraft like this. He handed over control to the first officer so that she could complete the landing. When one pilot flies, it's the other pilot's job to monitor their flying. But without being able to see out his windscreen, the captain wasn't fully able to monitor the first officer. He simply had to follow what she was doing on his instruments, making sure that she was staying on the glide path and that her speed was safe. On top of this was one of the few times outside of the simulator that the first officer had to carry out an approach and landing while manually controlling the thrust levers. This was hardly an emergency, but her lack of hands-on experience with this had the effect of increasing her workload at a point in the flight where she really could have done without such an inconvenience.
50,
The automated voice in the cockpit counted
40,
down the aircraft's altitude as it approached the runway.
30, 20.
At 5 minutes to 11 UK time, Flight 870 finally touched down safely at Budapest. With the captain still unable to see out his windscreen, the first officer taxied the aircraft off the runway and back to the stand. When back at the gate, the captain wrote up the remaining faults in the aircraft's technical log. Both the crew and passengers were extremely lucky that the aircraft's power didn't get cut off a second time. But the question still remained as to why it had been cut off in the first place. As it turned out, this was not the first occurrence of a serious electrical power loss on an Airbus A320 series aircraft. Going back over the last 10 years, investigators found as many as 5 similar incidents, including one which happened just as the aircraft was making its final approach to the runway. This was clearly a problem with Airbus aircraft, but when engineers began trying to hone in on the original cause for the loss of power on Flight 870, they couldn't find it. They knew that it had something to do with Gen 1, but after a series of tests, they were unable to replicate exactly what had happened. This finding, or lack thereof, had a frightening implication. A similar loss of power could happen again on any Airbus A320 series aircraft without warning. As a result, the final report into the incident recommended that Airbus make changes which were focused on minimizing the seriousness of a similar event, rather than on preventing it altogether. Following these recommendations, Airbus have since added a backup electrical supply to the cockpit floodlight, meaning that if there is a serious power loss, the standby instruments remain visible. Newer Airbus aircraft have replaced the old mechanical standby instruments with a single LCD display. Being a screen, it's lit by default, and, needless to say, it has its own independent power supply, making it invulnerable to any power loss that affects the main instrumentation. And perhaps most crucially of all, Airbus have since modified their software such that in the event of a power loss of this sort, the aircraft automatically switches to its alternate electrical supply, rather than waiting for the pilots to do this. This means that power is restored much more quickly. It is often said that aviation safety rules are written in blood, but this isn't the whole story. Small incremental changes of the sort that resulted from Flight 870 have saved countless lives over the years. The passengers of Flight 870 were fortunate that they fell into this category of incidents. Thanks again to War Thunder for sponsoring this video. Play War Thunder now for free on PlayStation, PC or Xbox by using my link in the pinned comment below or in the video description. New players, or those who haven't played in over 6 months, will get access to a massive bonus pack available across all platforms. This pack includes lots of premium vehicles and an exclusive vehicle decorator. It's available for a limited time only, so be quick.